Hello, this lecture is World War II, and it is an examination of the economy in Canada and the United States. For Americans and Canadians, World War II ended the Great Depression. The war generated tremendous large-scale industry and heavy manufacturing to meet the demands of total war. As the war progressed, the new normal was significant government intervention in the economy. In 1939, the Canadian federal government debt was over $5 billion. Federal government revenue was $562 million, or about $50 for every person in the nation. There were about 45,000 working in civil service and 12,000 delivering mail. The years that followed witnessed major government growth. Initially, the Liberal government was cautious about Canadian overcommitment to the war. The government's focus was on the domestic economy. Reflecting this doctrine of limited war, political economist and trusted advisor O.D. Skelton wrote to Prime Minister King explaining that it is in the economic field that we can give aid that will be most effective to our allies and most consistent with Canadian interests. It seemed a safe and sensible approach to the Liberal government. This so-called reign of dollar, coined by one historian, ended in 1940 after the Germans scored devastating military victories in Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and France. The new doctrine became total war. More government officials called for an interventionist state to regulate the economy. O.D. Skelton died in early 1941, but there were other voices for bigger government and more economic and social planning. One individual was Clifford Clark. Much like Skelton, he was another economist and high-ranking civil servant. An increasing number of officials welcomed the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, especially the use of fiscal and monetary measures to help moderate the effects of economic cycles. Still on the books, the War Measures Act of 1914 gave the government more leeway to take command of the economy in a way not possible in peacetime. The normal legislative process was set aside and orders and council brought in a series of sweeping measures. The new thinking was that it was strict government control rather than the marketplace that made the difference with wages and prices, essential industries, and employment. Never had Canada experienced such big government. Keynesian theory became popular with elites, but civil servants lacked the time, mandate, and knowledge to work out a grand master plan. In fact, the first few years might be better described as crisis management. Canadian war production was the focus of the Department of Munitions and Supply, created in 1940. The minister in charge was C.D. Howe. Whenever there was a gap within the private sector, Howe created Crown corporations. These government-owned businesses numbered 28 by the end of the war. They employed as many as 25,000 war production workers. By mid-war, Canada was producing over 4,000 aircraft a year. Most of the war production took place in Ontario and Quebec, a fact that upset the Prairie West and the Maritime provinces in the East. Howe's primary concern was speed of war production, not redistribution of wealth to the Canadian East and West. Actually, all regions of Canada did well economically. The West had agriculture, and the Maritimes had lumber and seaports for the Navy and Merchant Marine. The long, dark shadow of the dismal 30s was gone. High taxation and borrowing soon became the norm. Taxation was a way of reducing private consumer demands that competed with war needs. Income tax rates increased significantly. In 1938-39, only about 2% of Canadians paid income taxes. By 1945, about 19% paid income taxes. There was never enough revenue, however. War bond drives took place throughout the duration of the war. Manufacturers geared up to meet the rise of war orders. Between 1939 and 1941, the number of employees in manufacturing increased by about 50%. Trade with Britain changed when it ceased to export goods. By 1944, exports to the United Kingdom had increased by 300%. This trading shift raised the question of who was going to pay for the British orders. The British had turned their productive capacity inward and was no longer exporting. Without exports, Britain was not earning foreign currency. For the first 2 years, Britain used its foreign currency reserves to pay Canada. By 1941, it was broke in terms of international currency flows. As for Canada, its purchases of American goods had to be paid for in American dollars. The Foreign Exchange Control Board was set up to discourage the discouraging for the use of American dollars for non-war purposes. Fortunately, it was action by the Americans that stemmed the Canadian outflow of currency and gold. The Hyde Park Agreement, signed in April 1941 by the Americans and Canadians, allowed the two countries to share their industrial capacity and resources for the defense of North America. The United States buying more defense materials and supplies from Canada was a welcome development. The agreement also broadened Lend-Lease arrangements with Canada and Britain. Lend-Lease was a US program of assisting the Allies which did not require immediate repayment. The expectation was that the equipment be returned to the US after the war and that Canada and Britain agreed to have open multilateral trade in the post-war period. In Canada, key goods were rationed so that the Army and the war industry received the necessary supplies. In 1941, government established strict wage and price controls. Government feared inflation and potential labor instability. The task of controlling prices was given to the Wartime Prices and Trade Board. As it turns out, inflation was only in the 5 to 6% range throughout the war. On the issue of employment, Canada saw large numbers of women enter the workforce. By mid-1943, there were 200,000 women directly engaged in war. That is, engaged in war work. By the end of the war, the civil service grew to about 115,000, more than doubling the 1939 number. Government expenditures increased 800%, and the debt rose to 18 billion. Canada had its big government. Before the war ended, politicians and bureaucrats worried about the reconstruction that would follow the war. Veterans Affairs was a new department established to help prevent the sharp economic dislocation that occurred after World War I. The department offered a whole range of benefits for returning soldiers: subsidized mortgages, health benefits, and education allowances. For all Canadians, there was the implementation of the family allowance. This was in 1945. Canadian leaders also believed it was vital to support greater trade with others. They supported the reduction or removal of international trade barriers. Canadian economic hopes hinged on strong American trade and investment. Now turning to the United States. The economic story of World War II for the United States was also higher production and employment and bigger government. No other nation came close to the productivity of the awakened economic giant. In 1939, unemployment remained high in the United States. In 1940, there were about 8 million jobless. The United States had not fully recovered from the 1937-38 recession. By 1944, unemployment practically disappeared. In fact, there was a manpower shortage. Women were the answer of much of the manpower shortage. Rosie the Riveter was symbolic of women working numerous industrial jobs, many of them physically challenging. During the war, it was important that labor management relations remained good. In 1941, the formation of the National Defense Mediation Board was to deal with disputes. In early 1942, President Roosevelt established a 12-man National War Labor Board as a new agency to handle labor disagreements. However, I should point out its primary focus was on wage stabilization. The federal government strictly controlled much of American industry, and notable was the Office of Production Management, which sought to, quote, formulate and execute in the public interest measures to increase and regulate production of defense materials. In August 1941, the Supplies, Priorities, and Allocation Board was set up to create policies and programs for the Office Production Management to carry out. The War Production Board was another agency established after the attack on Pearl Harbor in early December 1941. The War Production Board took over the duties of both the Supplies, Priorities, and Allocation Board and Office Production Management. Many other agencies were formed during the war. In early 1943, the Office of War Mobilization was established to coordinate all war programs. In the same year, the War Food Administration began as an agency that supervised agricultural productions. The rising demand of the armed forces and allies meant that the war was a major economic boost for farmers. Financing the war was a pressing issue for the government. Peak federal spending was for the year 1945 when it reached 100 billion. From 1940 to 1946, the federal government spent almost 400 billion. In 1945, the federal debt was close to 250 billion, and the national income was 182 billion. Thus, the debt was 40% higher than the national income. The fiscal program adopted by the government was a compromise between borrowing and taxation. It should be noted that in 1940, John Maynard Keynes published a pamphlet called How to Pay for the War. And this was an application of Keynesian economics. Its focus on balancing taxation and borrowing was influential on British and American policymakers. Borrowing by governments is really deferred taxation. With borrowing, there is the threat of looming inflation. One important consideration was that the high unemployment at the start of the war allowed the government to increase spending without being overly concerned about inflation. But the use of paper money did spell inflation, thus the government borrowed through the sales of war bonds. Bonds are legal commitments to pay fixed amounts of money on a fixed date. The sale of long-term bonds to individuals had the same effect as a tax. There was the taxing of any interest earned. It was important that personal funds used to buy bonds could not be used to purchase civilian goods. The sale of bonds to commercial banks or the use of bonds as collateral for bank loans was another issue. It meant an expansion in the total volume of purchasing power, thus the problem of inflation. It was a recipe for inflation to increase the buying ability of civilians while the supply of goods was reduced by government war purchases. In other words, there was money, but fewer products to buy. This bid up prices. The government used war bonds to finance military operations and to remove money from circulation. To help fight inflation, the government also brought in price controls that did not allow prices to fluctuate according to supply and demand. The policy of price controls had problems. Quote, there was a certain amount of deterioration in the quality of merchandise, and many producers sought to circumvent the controls by discontinuing low price lines and concentrating their production on more expensive items. Price controls had an impact on something simple such as a candy bar. For example, in 1943, Consumer Reports magazine revealed that 19 out of 20 candy bars tested were smaller than before the war began. Additional issues included a rise of black market activity and violations of price regulations. Price controls influenced employment numbers. A shortage of workers was one result of not allowing wages to rise to the level that they would have reached under supply and demand. However, this did encourage the hiring of women and others who normally were the last to be hired. Women took jobs that had lower wages due to price controls. There were other effects. For example, meat packing jobs at plants fell because more meat went on the black market. Another serious fact was that price control stored up surplus purchasing power, which, with a limited supply of commodities, necessitated the use of rationing to prevent hoarding and to ensure equity in distribution. Rationing of tires began in January 1942 and gasoline in May of 1942. By the following year, ration items were bicycles, typewriters, footwear, sugar, coffee, and food items. As it turns out, the lower velocity of circulation, in other words, the number of times a unit of money currency changes hands, did help offset the inflationary effect of a boosted up monetary supply that came with the increase in debt. Overall, World War II price controls had shortcomings. Thomas Sowell argues that, quote, price control in the form of a floor under prices, preventing these prices from falling further, produce surpluses as dramatic as the shortages produced by price control in the form of a ceiling, preventing prices from rising higher. It was understood that taxes were anti-inflationary, but politicians agreed that it was impossible to devise an equitable and acceptable tax for financing the total cost of the war. Roosevelt favored taxes. Almost 2 years before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt sought additional taxes. Congress was slow to respond, but in June 1940, there was a rise in personal income and corporate taxes. In October 1940, there was a further hike in taxes. Now we're talking 1 year even before Pearl Harbor. By September 1941, the maximum rate on personal income tax was 77%, and the corporate income tax was 31%. In October 1942, Congress passed a new tax bill making the maximum rate 88% and the corporate rate 40%. Early in 1944, Congress passed another tax law putting the maximum income tax rate at 94%. But Roosevelt wanted Congress to go further with other taxes, and thus he vetoed the bill. In February of 1944, Congress passed the bill over the presidential veto. Thus, wealthy job creators earned 6 cents for every dollar. And thus the government got 94 cents for every dollar. By the end of the war, approximately 44% of the war had been financed by taxes and 56% by borrowing. These numbers were about 10% off from World War II. For the Great War, borrowing had been 66% and taxes 34%. American productivity was stunning. In less than 5 years, the United States produced about 300,000 aircraft, 77,000 naval and merchant ships, and almost 87,000 tanks. In 1944, American war production was in the range of twice as great as Germany, Italy, and Japan put together. Quote, total production as measured by the gross national product at constant prices in 1944 was 70% above the 1939 level. Much of the Allied victory was due to the productive capacity of America. Of course, there were interesting consequences to the priority that war production received. American production of automobiles ceased. Automobile factories became the sites for production of army vehicles, tanks, and planes. American people owning a car had no alternative but keep their older cars running. Wartime production came out of the American economy at the expense of consumer goods that would otherwise have been produced by American industry. The economic effects of the war on the public were significant. The average weekly wage in manufacturing doubled from 1939 to 1944. This despite wage controls. A longer work week of 45 hours and overtime pay for work over 40 hours was the reason for the higher pay. Despite shortages in consumer goods, consumption expenditures rose 30% from 1939 to 1945. Thus, the standard of living rose. Personal savings reached about 37 billion compared to less than 3 billion in 1939. Farms did well. Net income per farm operator rose from about $700 in 1939 to over $2,000 in 1945. With such prosperity, the foreclosure rate on farm mortgages fell to almost zero. At the end of the war, the trade balance ran in favor of the United States. It was running at the rate of about 10 billion a year. Wartime restrictions limited construction activities, and many states could not spend the increased income generated by the war. As a consequence, many states accumulated substantial surpluses. Of course, the big economic story was the rise of big government during the war years. The American government grew, but one interesting point was the resiliency of the market. For example, let's take the example of Japan. The conflict between America and Japan was brutal, but this did not stop the dynamics of a market economy expanding domestically and internationally. Soon, Americans would be buying Japanese-made cameras, even if American officials might be unaware that the Japanese even made cameras. As Thomas Sowell explains, quote, if someone else, somewhere else, has a better product or a lower price for the product or service, that fact gets conveyed and acted upon through prices without any elected official or planning commission having to issue orders to consumers or producers. Indeed, faster than any planners could assemble the information on which to base their orders. So with Japan, in subsequent years and into the decades, the Japanese offered many products that were that Americans wanted to purchase. And one example I have there is Honda. first motorcycles and then later cars. The punishment that America inflicted on Japan during the war did not destroy Japan's human capital. Human capital, invisible inside people's heads, is often more crucial to a nation's long-term prosperity. For both Canada and the United States, the federal government gained more control of the economy during the war. The governments met the massive economic challenge of the war. There was a level of confidence not seen in many years. It was not easy for the governments to relinquish this control in peacetime and go back to earlier economic times. More to the point, Keynesian thinking was here to stay and dominate. And indeed, it did dominate for at least another 3 decades. Thank you.